Good evening. This is the Wine of Life podcast. Doing another quick video. Pastor Wes. This one's going to be on the new leak that happened with regards to the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Everybody's freaking out one way or the other, and I'm pro-life, and there's been a lot of strange reactions to Roe v. Wade possibly being overturned. People who were pro-life are saying it was done the wrong way and things like that. And so there's been some strange reactions to people in major institutions that would be evangelical institutions. And but there was a bill that came up in Louisiana this past week or 2 weeks ago that was called the House Bill 813 in Louisiana, that was trying to abolish abortion completely. And the ERLC, which is a institution that is it's an SBC entity, so it's paid for by the SBC churches. It opposed the bill, and this caused a big controversy. Now, in fairness to them, all of the pro-life groups in Louisiana opposed the bill for different reasons. The Catholic bishops opposed it. Family Forum opposed it. The pro-life thing, whatever that pro-life movement group opposed it. So a bunch of people opposed it because of its vagueness, and it had rules about birth control, and I guess it was very similar to the rule that the Alabama tried to pass the other year, where it was like criminalizing miscarriages, where it could hold people who had miscarriages for up to 48 hours in jail. So people opposed it, but the ERLC opposed it, but they didn't oppose it for the same reasons that the other groups opposed it. They opposed it because of the part of the bill that was going to criminalize and give the state the ability to prosecute women for having abortions. And we know that this is not their position, because Denny Burke, who's a professor of at an SBC seminary, the Southern Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, wrote a blog about this and stated what the so-called mainstream position for the pro-life movement has been. And so he appeals to a lot of things from the past. A lot of people have brought up, certain Republican statements from the past, and that they weren't abolitionists, they were pro-choice in certain issues, in certain circumstances. They brought up people like, W.A. Griswold was pro-choice. Falwell in the 60s was pro-choice. The 72 resolution from the SBC was obviously it was pro-choice. It was for the legalization of abortion federally. And then I think 7 of the 9 judges were in 73 were appointed by conservatives and all that stuff. So they bring up all this stuff about not necessarily being abolitionists of abortion, but that really isn't relevant. Because whatever their positions were, some of them changed. I don't think Falwell would have held the same position in the 80s that he held in the 60s. He certainly didn't over segregation. And I don't care what Republicans think. I don't consider them a pro-life group anyways. But the point is that we don't appeal to authorities from the past. We don't appeal to rulings from the past with regards to Christian ethics. We try to appeal to what the scriptures say, and we go from there. Now, some things you can make legal, some things you can't. We live in a pluralistic society. We know that. But with regards to something like murder, we have a certain opinion about it because it's murder, not because we're trying to be, Christian about it. We're not telling people they have to become Christians. We're saying murder is wrong, which we would think everybody would agree with. And so if murder is wrong, the person who performs the murder and the person involved in the murder has done something criminal. So it seems logical that if Roe v. Wade is overturned and certain states make abortion, criminalize it, that it's natural that you would prosecute the women who would get the abortions. And I think also the men who impregnate them should also, if they're involved in that, should also be prosecuted. But that's a whole other issue. The point is that the ERLC doesn't believe this, and Denny Burke doesn't believe this, and he decided to write a blog about it. And well, I have to say I don't quite agree with a lot of his points. And so he says that there are moral. Number one, his first point is there are moral issues with doing this, and he uses Scott Klusendorf, who wrote about this matter in dealing with a statement that then President Trump made, where he talks about if Roe v. Wade is overturned, which was one of his goals, which is why he appointed the judges he did. If it gets overturned, he wanted to start prosecuting women. And so this is what Mr. Klusendorf has to say. What the consequences should be in this case would hinge not only on the circumstances of the act, who can possibly say what the consequences should be until all the relevant facts are known, as it does in all homicide cases, but also on whether there's been what criminology professor Mike Adams calls a meeting of the minds. That is, the woman and the abortionist would have to have a meeting of the minds. That is to say, did the woman contracting the abortion have the same understanding of the act and same proximity to it as the abortionist? Now, there's a question that already comes up. One is, what about someone who hires someone to kill someone else? What is their full meaning of it with regards to meeting of the minds, how it's going to be done? What is going to be the proximity of the person who hired that other person to perform this act? So, for instance, he uses the idea that the abortionist will use a Doppler device, which is inaudible to the patient, to detect a crushing fetal heartbeat. His acts are clearly premeditated. True, the mother and the abortionist have a meeting of the minds in that they agree on having the abortion, but they rarely meet because that point, the mother rarely knows what the abortionist knows. In other words, because the mother is not a professional murderer, she doesn't actually know what's being done. I would disagree with that. I think even though you don't know all of the medical aspects going into the killing of the child, you still know what's being done. I don't think that works at all. Now, he says this at the end, which I think totally kills Denny Burke's point, because what he's trying to say is that he's not being inconsistent or hypocritical in saying that women shouldn't be prosecuted. But this is the end of Klusendorf's statement. He says again, even if pro-lifers are inconsistent on the issue of consequences, how would that in any way prove the unborn are not human, or that intentionally killing them is justified? At best, it proves individual pro-lifers are failing to consistently apply their ethic, not that they failed to make a case for the humanity of the unborn and the inhumanity of abortion, which is again what I would say that he in fact is being inconsistent. Now, what he would say about people who are pushing for the prosecution of women is that they are fringe, that there's actually a tiny minority of people within the SBC who are pushing for this because they're fringe, they're out of the norm, and they're not holding the consistent pro-life position. I completely disagree with that, and I would agree with Klusendorf's last statement here, that some pro-lifers are just inconsistent. I think that Denny Burke here is the one who's being hypocritical, and I think the ERLC is being particularly hypocritical, and that's difficult because they are funded by the SBC, so that's by SBC churches. Now, the second point is that he brings up this idea from Numbers 35, which brings up the city of refuge, and that there needs to be a sliding scale of accountability here with regards to what happens. And I do agree with that. But I don't think that we can say it perfectly matches on to the other, our justice system and the justice system in Israel. For instance, the people, when they committed the act that ended up killing somebody in Numbers 35, they then had to leave their city, they had to leave their spouse, they had to leave their children, they had to leave everything and go to this city of refuge, and they could not leave. And if they did leave, the avenger of blood would find them and kill them. Now, the only way they could be freed from that is if the priest at the time when they performed the act had died, and that's a picture of Christ being our high priest, dying for us and allowing us a clean slate, because he then resurrects and is now our high priest before God to be an advocate for us. But so there isn't really any way that we can perfectly match on the two legal systems, but from a moral point of view, the point is that even though they didn't mean to kill the person, they still had to leave the community. They still were judged legally. The same thing happened with Cain. Even though Cain wasn't put to death for killing Abel, he was cast out from the presence of God. And as we go on through the article, or through the blog post rather, you'll find that Denny Burke starts with the idea of a sliding scale, which I can see. I can see how people could argue from that point, because, for instance, a woman who's raped wants to get an abortion. There's all sorts of things happening: trauma, psychological, mental issues. You then go to a woman who just gets pregnant because she's, not careful. She wants to carry on with her career. She has an abortion. You're not going to necessarily count them as the same in the same way because of the circumstances, which is normal in homicide cases. There are always different types of circumstances, but they're still both judged. So even somebody who is charged with first-degree murder gets a different sentence than somebody with third-degree or second-degree murder. They still get sentenced, and they still get separated from the community and judged by law. If we, or a state, criminalizes abortion, then if you have an abortion, you have broken the law. So you have to be prosecuted criminally. That's just that's the logic of this. Second, he brings up this idea of a legal issue. So the first one's moral issue, which I don't think holds up. The second one is a legal issue. And he brings up pre-Roe v. Wade situations. And he brings up 3 policy judgments. Why did states target abortionists rather than the woman in the pre-Roe v. Wade era, so pre-1973? He said the point of abortion law is effective enforcement against abortionists. Second, the woman is actually a victim of the abortionist. And third, the prosecuting the woman is counterproductive to the goal of enforcement of the law against abortionists. And so he brings up the fact that some of the abortionists in the pre-Roe v. Wade era would bring in the woman because the woman would be the only evidence that an abortion had taken place anyways, and that because she was counted as an accomplice, she would then not testify against the abortionist, and then they'd end up both getting off. The issue with this is that we live in a different time, obviously. Nobody, speaks with each other outside of, say, the devices we have. And so can we get evidence other than the testimony of a woman like you would in, say, a 1967 case? I think we can. So I don't see how there's a block in that way. Another part is that there's some sort of claim. There's a sort of a social claim. And he gets this from Francis Beckwith, wrote a book called Defending Life that you can check out. So there's this social claim that women, because of the propaganda of pro-choice policy and thought within our culture, that women don't really know what a baby is, that they don't understand that they're having a human being, and therefore they don't fully grasp that they're putting to death another human being when they have an abortion. And I wholeheartedly reject this issue. And he brings up the fact that there's substantial evidence that people who have abortions go through massive amounts of depression and issues. They don't go through depression and all of those things because they then start reading scientific journals and find out, they actually killed a person. They go through it because they have a pang of conscience. So it is within our conscience. We know that we have what a human is and what a human is not. God has placed this within us. We can read Romans 1 and come to that conclusion, I think, fairly easily. So we know that murdering someone is in fact wrong. This is why most people, when they do murder people, they don't brag about it. They tend to try and hide it so you don't get caught, because they know it's wrong. So I don't fall for that sort of argument. I don't see that that's a legitimate argument to say that women, think about the Israelites coming out of Egypt. For 400 years, they have been involved and entrenched in idolatry. And yet, God gives the Ten Commandments on the stone tablets, writes it with his finger. They build the golden calf. What does Moses come down and do? He judges them. Right, 23,000 fell. They took the swords out and they killed, or maybe that was 3,000. Either way, a good amount of people died because they committed idolatry. Now, that would have been a major shock to a lot of them, because they had been worshiping idols for centuries. It's been in their family. They've been doing it for a long, long time. The idea that you are acquitted of guilt because something has been entrenched within your society. I would say, think about it from this perspective. In the 1920s, one of the big issues with the Scopes trial was that the so-called pro-science side was arguing that black people weren't human. They were saying that they're not as evolved. And the Christian side was saying, no, they're made in the image of God. Now, the Christian side lost because he couldn't handle the debate, and he died 5 days later or something. But the idea that our culture has actually been saying for a long, long time, and even within the SBC, who supported slavery way back when in the 1850s and 60s, has been saying that black people weren't human, and we know that federally we could not get lynching to be a crime. Federally, we couldn't get that through. You would not be not guilty of killing a black person, say in 1940, because you could say, well, it's been entrenched in our society for so long, it's been 100 years plus, and we've always said that black people weren't human, and so we should be able to kill them. That's not an actual excuse that you can use legally or morally. You can't. That's not a biblical argument at all. And legally, you can't use that. Once law is put in place, you can't then break that law and say, well, before it was different, so it should be okay now. It doesn't really work that way. The same thing goes for something like slavery. You can't own slaves and say, well, it used to be legal, and so it's, or say it was in your family or something. So I don't see these as legitimate arguments. Now, if he wants to hold this position, I would say the ERLC holding this position is very, very bad for the SBC. I think it'll probably lead to a split if this continues. But if Denny Burke wants to hold this position, fair enough. He's a professor, and people are always going to have their own opinions. My issue is the way that he frames it. The idea that people who want this, if it's criminalized in states, that they're holding some sort of fringe position to want to prosecute women and hold them accountable for murdering their child, that's fringe, that's unbiblical, that it's immoral, and it's something that's not lawful. For one, I don't think it's fringe. I think if Denny Burke and I went to 50 different Southern Baptist churches in South Carolina in the next month, and we spoke at 50 different churches, I think at least 25, I think we'd split. I think 25 would side with me at least, that's at least a logical conclusion that if abortion is illegal, then the person who has the abortion is in fact legally liable. So I don't think it's as fringe as he's trying to make it, one. Two, I don't think it can be held up biblically at all. You can't just say that there are some legal things that he has. So, for instance, the legal issue about them being accomplices and the woman not, testifying against the abortionist, and those are legal nuances that people who are legal experts can deal with. But biblically, I don't think there's any real discussion over whether somebody should be held liable criminally if something is illegal. If they break the law and it's murder, they should be punished. I don't know how you can get around that biblically when you're talking about murder. So the fact that he's trying to frame this as fringe is pretty troubling. And the fact that the ERLC is holding this position is also quite troubling, because obviously the SBC is we're funding these entities, and they're putting out these ideas that are not only something that I don't think most of the congregations within the Southern Baptist Convention would hold, but things that are at least can be argued as being completely unbiblical. And I would say they are unbiblical. But I'm worried about the fact that people that these things are being framed as fringe and out of bounds to be talked about, and you're not really pro-life if you hold this position. I think that's ridiculous. So those are my concerns about this, the way that this is being framed by some of the people who are, I guess you'd call them elites or whatever, in the SBC, and some of the bigger issues within the SBC. The fact that there aren't a lot of leaders coming out and speaking out against the ERLC's position on this, not specifically the bill in Louisiana, but the overall idea that women should not be prosecuted. I get that it's controversial, but I don't think coming to that conclusion is fringe at all. I think it's a logical conclusion to come to. So that's my position on that. I think that if it's criminalized, you should be prosecuted, plain and simple. And I think men also, there should be some level of responsibility with regards to men in that as well, especially if they know about it, or they help financially, or they take them to the abortionist. They should also be held legally liable as well. And we can have arguments about what the levels of guilt and stuff like that should be applied in all the different cases, but saying that you should have immunity, which is something he argues at the very end of the article, that women should be able to get immunity. I can't go with that. He says this is the very last paragraph here. Abolitionists today wish to prosecute post-abortive women. Do they realize this approach may very well make it impossible to successfully prosecute actual abortionists? Do they really want to put the woman on the side of the abortionist and thereby discourage her from helping the prosecution of the abortionist? I hope not. In my view, a consistently pro-life position will always stay laser-focused on supporting public policy that punishes the abortionist. In the long run, this is the best way to abolish abortion, and I hope and pray the abolitionists will eventually be able to see that. And so what he's saying is that essentially abolitionists are not really abolitionists. They're doing something that actually will be hindering the abolition of abortion, and I don't see that as being accurate at all. The person who decides that they need to kill their child for whatever reason has to be held legally liable. That's my position. If you have a whole lot of other positions, or you completely disagree with all of it, you're pro-choice, whatever, let me know in the comments below. If you liked it, subscribe. If you don't like it, let me know that too. And we will talk to you later. Bye.